South Asia is one of the least connected regions in the world. That's about trade. 5% of interregional trade only makes up 5% of total trade. But it's also about investment. Interregional foreign direct investment only makes up 2% of total FDI. There's already been a couple of brilliant presentations which have opened that fact out and looked at it from a very strategic perspective. So I'm going to take a more focused look at, from DFID's perspective, what we are doing in Nepal and what that tells us about three key areas: public-private partnerships, spatial planning, and federalism. Because fundamentally, this lack of investment, this lack of trade, is a missed opportunity for development, and it's a missed opportunity for poverty reduction. So firstly, creating an environment that supports public-private partnerships and foreign investment is going to be essential to build connectivity. It's hugely challenging to put new infrastructure in place, particularly in a region such as the Himalayan region. And private investment is going to be essential to help governments address the financing challenges they face, but also to find technical solutions to the incredibly complicated challenges that infrastructure faces. It's great that through the work of the Investment Board of Nepal, which DFID supports, Nepal is experimenting with ways of addressing these challenges and helping to put PPPs, private-public partnerships, in place in infrastructure. Now that process is just beginning, but, well, it's moving forward. But there are examples from across the region of these connections. So Aran 3 is an example of an Indian company coming in to support the development of a hydropower plant. West Seti hydropower plant, on the other hand, is an example of a Chinese investment. And the solid waste project for Kathmandu is an example of a development from a European country. So there are a range of different public-private investments which are starting. And these projects can bring massive benefits to a country like Nepal. So Aran 3 has got the potential to create 3,000 jobs. It will generate 25% of the electricity. The free electricity it generates will represent 25% of the Nepal's current generation capacity. And it will be the first hydropower plant to actually export electricity from Nepal to India and could generate $2 billion of revenue. So it's massively important that these investments follow through from planning and conceptualization to construction. And that, I think, is a huge challenge that needs to be addressed. The second area I wanted to talk about was spatial planning. Because to achieve the synergies that are possible from different types of infrastructure, they need to be planned in a coordinated way. And Nepal and other countries in the region need mechanisms for achieving this, such as thinking about special economic zones or thinking about economic corridors. There are many constraints that manufacturing firms in Nepal face as a result of unreliable energy supply, poor transport infrastructure, excessive regulations, difficult access to land. And all of these constraints stop them being competitive enough to export, and therefore limit the potential for connections. And these constraints are, to be honest, hard to address. But by focusing in on special economic zones, it may be possible to address all of these constraints in one place and make a difference to firm competitiveness. And the first SEZ in Nepal is in Bairua. And it's faced delays. It's important to be honest. It's faced delays, particularly with access to electricity. But I think now there is potential that those problems can start to be addressed. And if they can be resolved, then I think that SEZs have a massive potential to promote manufacturing, which has declined significantly in Nepal in recent years, and to help address a rising trade imbalance and generate inclusive jobs. Spatial planning, though, is also important to get the most, as a way of getting the most out of infrastructure. So in a region like the Himalayas, where it's very easy for infrastructure investments to be scattered and to be disconnected, economic corridors can help to provide a solution. So you can concentrate infrastructure and economic development along strategic trade routes. And that generates the potential for inclusive growth that brings more people into opportunities. DFID has a project working on the western corridor from Pokhara in the hills in Nepal down through the Bairoa SEZ to the border with India. And those kind of strategic trade routes, those kind of corridors have huge potential. But one can really also imagine a much more regional perspective to these corridors. And I think there's an opportunity there, and maybe it's something that the Himalayan consensus could think about, in terms of how do you build a strategic understanding of economic corridors that could help provide arteries for growth and connectivity. Finally, I wanted to briefly reflect on the implications of federalism for economic development in Nepal. And there are two types of opportunities that it's worth thinking about. First, resources are going to be spent in a more distributed way across the country. And that brings opportunities for new types of businesses and bringing more people into business, particularly including women, and more people into the formal economy. And secondly, if local government is closer to people, there's an opportunity that it will become more accountable and better able to invest in and maintain infrastructure. But there's also risks. And there's a risk that spatial planning will suffer because local governments are not able to coordinate effectively with each other, and that there is poor coordination between federal government and provincial governments and local governments. If you can get the opportunities right, you can really hardwire resilience and growth into local planning, and particularly into local urban development. But doing that's going to mean working really hard to mitigate the risks. So particularly thinking about mechanisms for effective coordination and collaboration, and thinking about how to use fiscal transfers in clever ways to encourage better coordination between the different levels of government, the different spheres of government. So in conclusion, I think it's really important to think about these quite practical building blocks of connectivity. How do you put in place good public-private partnerships? How do you think about spatial planning in a way that joins thinking up? And how do you make sure that important governance changes, such as federalism, are carried out in ways that create opportunities for inclusive growth and connectivity and don't allow different components of government to become atomized? I'm very proud of the work that DFID is doing on these kind of issues through the Investment Board of Nepal and through our Economic Policy Incubator. But it's also very clear that the kind of step change that's required to address the gap in connectivity is going to require work by governments, it's going to require work by private sector, it's going to require work by people, and it's going to require bringing in academics and civil society. And I think that's the sort of challenge that an organisation like the Himalayan Consensus can help us to build towards and address. Thank you very much for your time.